So, some announcements. Unfortunately, my time working at the dairy farm just outside of the village here, and thus my time staying in this apartment flat for the winter will be short-lived. I'll discuss this more in a separate video, but, well, unfortunately, my current employers aren't able to provide me payment for what we had negotiated. More specifically, I was only being paid for half the months starting from December, so the end portions of the months for my manual labor. But that's too expensive for them at this point in time, and apparently I am not meeting expectations that they would have hoped for in terms of being able to function with managing my tasks. And I myself have, well, my frustration with my employers has reached a tipping point. And so I said in, well, my Exploring St. Paul de Montmagny video, that my employers were very compassionate people. Well, I really have to stop judging certain people really quickly in that regard. Because, no, they're not. Not extensively compassionate, that is. Well, what they were displaying before wore off. It wore off relatively quick. And there is some information about them specifically in their small farming company and affiliations to the village municipality that I didn't know prior, and I should have looked into more as I did. Well, I had been trying to find out since living here more of the village history. But well, some things that are very overall unethical by my stance, that well, I regret working for them to some degree now. But so I won't be staying in St. Paul de Montmagny for the rest of the winter. On the 12th of February, I will be returning back to the city of Levis, and possibly back to the independent homeless shelter that I was at for a time before coming here. But, well, that all remains to be seen. I'm also another announcement going forward for videos. I'm going to try, instead of making entire videos recapping and correcting things that I was inaccurate on, which I've done in the past, I'm going to try and more so just state things that I've said in previous videos, or thoughts of mine, beliefs I've held that were inaccurate in the past, that I've come to change my perception on. And this may directly relate to things in the video, or it may not. It's just something I feel would be better. But in this case, it does to a large degree. Now, I've talked about this before, but I've never really directly, looking back, I've never directly said it. So I'd like to clear it up. Is that my beliefs towards modern medicine, modern healthcare, I used to believe that some amount of systematic regulation and the common medications and surgical procedures in terms of, well, mass amounts of them and certain treatments were beneficial for patient, the patient's health, those who suffer from various psychological and physiological diseases, disorders. Well, if that wasn't apparent by this point, I was wrong about that. I've completely changed my stance on it and just never fully said that. And I talked about in relation to my last video when I was in Lungale, that was fully dedicated to correcting things I was wrong about. That in relation to addictions, that I used to believe that it was both an element of emotional dependency and then physiological dependency that could develop because of certain factors. Well, it's not physiological, it's all emotional as far as I'm concerned. That's the reason, that is the base reason for the physiological dependency development. So there's that. And well, now let me get on with what I'll try my best to articulate in this video. Well, it dawned on me that, along with other things I have discussed recently in regards to cognitive epiphanies of mine, that it might sound harsh on a first glance observation, but I feel it is in reality uplifting. And that is, as of current, I believe that suicide is fundamentally the stupidest thing that any human being can do. Now, for those like me who suffer from depression, or listening to that and thinking that is extremely ableist and degrading to those suffering from suicidality, and that it's an argument that it's just, well, spiteful and unempathetic towards those suffering from depression and only further amplifies their depressive state, hear me out. So that's not truthful in the slightest. As someone who has suffered from suicidality in the past, someone who has made very elaborate, very idiotically elaborate plans to kill myself, And after having gotten to the point in my journey that I'm at now, and with my travels and with my continuous development of my analytical work, well, it really dawns on me. You know what? Let me just say, okay, I'm just going to explain this with some scenarios. I'm not really going to, I don't have another way of explaining it other than doing this. You've developed depression from the mass depravity of the environment around you, the societal, sociocultural environment around you that is highly seated in toxicity, that is highly problematic. Yes, there are beneficial things maybe to it, but there is a lot of problematic things ideologically that surround you. And in an interpersonal level, the treatment that you have received from family members in either malicious or benevolent ways. You've developed this depression, as far as I'm concerned, from external disrupt to your 5 subconscious desires, causing the culmination of conscious apathy, apathetic response, and in that, apathetic psychological disorders to form. In this regard, severe depression. And that is because, as far as I'm concerned, in relation to the subconscious, how we perceive the world in our childhood. This is why childhood trauma for all variants of psychological illness is crucial. But you are in a depressive state because of the realizations subtly, cognitively come to, of the lies and deceit of the world around you. And in that, apathetically, because, well, subconsciously, it's what you had been, it's what drove you towards a willingness to life, what you had perceived before as being beneficial. It's what drove you towards fulfillment. It's what motivated you. And the reason that now you are in this depressive state to a point of wanting to commit self-murder is because of that perception of your childhood. Thinking that that was the only beneficial means of life that really was presented to me. And now that I realize the reality of the world, there is no possibility, in a more pessimistic sense, for that benefit to come back in any form. Because what I had perceived as being beneficial was lies. That's wrong. One, if compassion, because it all comes back to, in regards to interactive loneliness, it comes back to feelings of compassion and community, of belonging that you had in your childhood to one degree or another. You would not be upset by the fact that you're perceiving it as, well, and rightfully so in regards to mass moral corruption of the world, various deplorable ideologies, right-wing nonsense that festers the globe. You're right in that. You would not be upset by the fact that the world is innately that, if you thought the world was innately that way and could not be anything but seated in this corruption, you wouldn't be upset by that fact. You wouldn't be. Because here's something that fundamentally pessimists and misanthropists don't understand, that most people don't understand. They don't. Most, those are the idiotic, moronic populists that don't bother to critically think or try to induce it, become accustomed to it. There will be the arguments in a nihilistically pessimistic outlook that, and in relation to misanthropy, that humanity is terrible, that humanity is inherently sociopathic, that we're egocentric externally, that we can only compete and destroy one another and the environment around us, on and on and on and on. These arguments for that point, that our nature is destructive. If that was our nature, you wouldn't be upset by it. If that was our nature, you wouldn't perceive that as being terrible. If we were from what we perceive as being morally deplorable, even for moral relativists who believe morality is relative, even though they're proclaiming a moral. From what we conceptualize cross-culturally as being abhorrent, if we use terminology like abhorrent, atrocious, destructive, terrible, all of these things, all these, well, in regards to, for me, the English language, but in any other language that meets those definitions, and you're convinced that humanity is that, you quite literally, you wouldn't be convinced of that, actually. That's what I'm saying. You wouldn't be convinced of that. If humanity was so-called sociopathic, a lack of empathy, lack of compassion or remorse towards other individuals, was domineering, was inherently, problematically self-centered in terms of external interactions with other people socially, that we were inherently antisocial. You would not perceive that as being a terrible thing if what we call anti-socialization was our nature. You wouldn't be depressed by it. You wouldn't be saddened, disheartened, dissatisfied, disappointed, all other forms of the apathetic response. You wouldn't be in that state of distress if that was our nature. And there will be people, they've used this argument on me as well, who claim that in order to keep moving forward in life in the shrivelest amount of optimism, I guess consciously, that they have, that we need to just keep having hope despite how horrible humanity truly is. I remember it was someone who I once knew once used the argument on me that our nature is terrible, it's true, but we don't always have to go with our nature, do we? And looking back on that statement, that is one of the most idiotic notions I've ever heard. Yes, you do have to go with your nature. You fundamentally can't escape your nature. Otherwise, it wouldn't be your innate nature. You fundamentally cannot escape your biology. So no, our nature is not terrible. Our world has become so seated and deeply rooted, entrenched in trauma, societal trauma, from pick any factor that I mentioned in previous videos, or pick any factor that you choose to focus on. Because of the widespread of this traumatization, it has caused layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of destructive social interactions. And I understand why so many people become traumatized psychologically to believing those delusions that humanity is terrible, because so many people can't see beyond the immediate surroundings they're in. And, well, quite frankly, the atrocities are everywhere. It's so hard, even for me, it's hard to see past the array of putridness that people enact in just the smallest ways on a daily basis. The smallest ways. Some knowingly, some unknowingly. But the reality is, as far as I've observed, it's not true. It's trauma. Trauma causing moral corruption. And in that relation to the fact that in regards to an apathetic conscious response, how you're only in a emotionally destroyed pit of despair because of years of disruption to your 5 subconscious desires, deprivation to interactive loneliness, to pro-socialization, genuine compassion and socialization with other human beings. And all that, the reason you having that apathetic response is because of a biologic thanatophobic protection mechanism, an innately embedded fear of death, fear of losing your life force. It is the only reason that you are depressed. You wouldn't be upset by these factors if it was so-called our nature. We can observe this in other animal species as well. Let's take an example, one that I could pull out right now, that of a saltwater crocodile. Saltwater crocodiles are known to be very, very confrontational, very antisocial reptiles. They're very aggressive when confronted even with members of their own species. And the males of the species have been known to rape the females in order to impregnate them for the mating seasons, things of the sort. And I have to look up again. I believe the females don't stay with their eggs, at least for long, once they've hatched. In fact, actually, also in that regard, the mothers can have at points, I think, to have been reported to eat their children if the children don't, once they've been birthed, leave the territory rather quickly. From our perception, this is horrible. And yes, I feel bad for saltwater crocodiles. But from their perception, the reality is this is not terrible. From the concept for us would be morally terrible amongst human beings. This isn't an atrocity. These aren't atrocities for the saltwater crocodiles. In fact, it's really not even, it wouldn't even really be fair, I don't think, to say to call them antisocial creatures, because, well, from our perception, yes, that's antisocial, but for them, that's not. That is their socialization patterns, behaviorally. To them, these aggressive sociopathic interactions, they aren't that. That is their nature. It's not a painful experience for them. All these different things, it's not emotionally, or yes, it could be physically painful to some degree, but actually even that is probably disputable. We can analyze in regards to, well, we know how human beings can develop for sexual attractions, not innately from trauma, and develop towards, say, masochistic tendencies or sadistic. Not inherently from trauma as far as I'm concerned. From certain other cultural environmental factors in relation to more strenuous activities in childhood, and culturally things that praised more intensive labor or things of the sorts. And in that regard, you can maybe look at that for those the saltwater crocodile, these reptiles. It might not even be fair to say that vicious attacks, cannibalism amongst one another, is painful to them, or that assaulting one another is painful to them. By their nature, this isn't destructive, because there have been zoologists that analyze these animals, obviously, and because in this regard, if you observe their behavioral patterns, obviously they don't dwell emotionally on, well, what we would consider problematic, negative social interactions, because this is how their nature functions. And for as much as I'll bring this up here, for as much as I do enjoy certain animal biologists who are on the internet and they have beneficial information to share, there are sadly those of them who over sensationalize the psychological patterns of animal species in correlation to mammalian life like us, those that aren't mammalian, and portray it in this overly dramatized sense on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, things of the sort, as if it's this abhorrent thing, as if for them it's abhorrent, which I don't think is genuinely scientifically provable. But for my example for this, what I mean is, the saltwater crocodile, as far as I'm concerned, it is not emotionally disrupted by what we perceive as being antisocial behavior, because that is its nature. That is how the animal has psychobiologically evolved. Mammalians, however, and specifically Homo sapiens, the human animal, because we are animals. Sadly, there are many misanthropists, and in that, this will be a topic for another video, vegan misanthropists, or those who abide more to veganism, that think otherwise and look past that fact of human beings being an animal, species of animal, mammalian life. For us, those psychological functions are problematic, because we've had years of psychoanthropology that has observed cultural groups that have operated in more compassionate means. So you would not be upset with the depravity of the world around you if that was our nature. And on top of that, the reason why I say, for those who somewhat know this, who have been through suicidality or have are thrown back into bouts of suicidal onset in a depressive episode. The reason I say that I feel by this point that committing suicide is the most idiotic decision you can make is, one, because we are very clearly drawn to life, as you would not be upset by you would not be in a depressive state if you thought suicide and if we didn't have an apathetic response. If you thought suicide was the answer, you wouldn't be in a depressive state. Depression, it wouldn't exist. It would not exist emotionally. But in that, clearly you are drawn towards life. And if you realize that if you have some amount of conscious realization that your despair is rooted in what you had perceived as being truthfully beneficial prior to this, and you've become disillusioned, to a point where you think clearly that if you weren't to abide by the oppressive forces that destroy your happiness, that demoralize you, if you weren't to abide by it, you'd be socially alienated, you'd run out of resources to sustain yourself physically, to survive on a physical basis, or that you'd be killed for going with what you feel to be provably morally right, if you can prove it, and you're completely cognitively, you're mentally shattered by this, because, as far as I'm concerned, you don't want to die, built-in fear of death, you want to be alive. Why would you commit suicide? I guess this is me asking myself this, reflecting back on my suicidality. Yes, I'll speak in the third person here. So Cam, let me get this straight. You're depressed about how murderous it would be for you to act upon what you truly believe, ideologically, to a point where people may deprive you completely of resources, throw you out into the cold streets, and socially alienate you to a point of conscious loneliness, not natural loneliness, to a point where you will die for doing that. And your only discerned solution to that is to kill yourself before they get the chance to do it? That really, and that thought right there has really put me in a really big further amount of my realizations recently, it's really amplified it. Because wow, was I delusional. Wow, was I... Because suicidality, it fundamentally is psychotic. It is delusional. As far as I'm concerned now. Really look back and think, wow, what an irrational, stupid. It's not an intellectual, it's not intellectual at all. It's not an intelligent reasoning. Not at all. Like, let me speak especially in regards of the homeless populace here, like myself. Obviously not at the moment, but soon to be again. The suicide reports or suicide attempts of the homeless population globally is extraordinarily high. It's one of the highest. I believe it's the second highest next to well, the second highest next to sexual assault victims. I'm pretty sure if the statistics are still on average reliable statistics are still calling that. It's extensively high because of the brutal, harsh conditions that are faced by the homeless socially, and because of the physical environments that they may be in. They don't have the proper resources at all from lack of, in a capitalist fascist system, to afford any material for survival that they can't make out of scrap. They get to a point of complete cognitive disrupt to just ending their life because of the complete sheer discomfort of the lifestyle, the pain and suffering. And in that, I really do say, why? Obviously, I know why. It's a rhetorical question, but my neuroscience work, I know why. That's obvious to me. But here's my thought process. As far as I'm concerned, I am trying to live as far as I see fit, to the best of my abilities, abiding by the morals I have discerned to be rightful. I have tried desperately to do that ever since leaving Toronto. Well, and more so ever since leaving Ottawa. I have desperately tried to. And people on here you don't know unless you've spoken to me directly. And even if you've spoken to me directly, you can know, but people really don't bother to inquire that much. Most don't know how hard I have tried when the camera is off to not contribute as much as I can to mass corruption of this world. I have paid many prices. And it's not just me. It's anyone else in my position who is doing the same thing. And there are others like me, as I've said before. The reality is that I know I recently made the video how, as far as I'm concerned, you can't be ethical until other people stop being unethical. Until others stop being or try and mitigate being immoral in their practices, you can't stop to a certain degree being immoral either. And being trying to remain ethically sound in this world, those who really, really, really try, it comes at a very taxing price, literally and figuratively. It comes at a very high price. This is, and just a side before I get on with what I was going to say. Side note, this is why I redesigned the political spectrum, and why I'm so hard on people who consider themselves far leftists so often. Either equally as much as the far right, or less or so, but still. Because of the piss poor tactics and methodologies to enact what is on a surface level beneficial moral values of liberation. Because so many, for so long, and it's not a modern day thing. It's not just in the prevalence of wokeism. It's not in the modern day. It's been prevalent throughout the various far left ideologies and methods of enactment, sadly, for a long duration of history. Because so many who think they're doing as much as they can to dismantle inherently, on a surface level, contradictions, ideologically oppressive forces, right-wing oppressive forces, and the centrist forces that pander to it. They're not. You're really not doing as much as you can. I'm not going to list all the examples here. That'll be for another time. But I think any of those who are of those stances, those identities, politically, I think they know what I'm talking about. I think they know who I'm talking about. You have not pushed yourself morally to the maximum that you can. You really haven't, and you still abide by suppression more than you have to. More than if you really, really tried, you have to. As I've said before, you have a choice. to get back on what I was saying there in regards to killing yourself. If you perceive the world, if you perceived the moral values you held as being beneficial, to a point of it's worth to some degree making sacrifice for them, then why would you not let the suppression towards your attempts at freedom do you in? Why wouldn't you let that be your ending? Instead of ending your own life. The way I see it, there is no better way to spend your life in terms of trying to provably garner a beneficial means at meaning, control, understanding, uniqueness, and familiarity. Your 5 subconscious desires, gratifying your willingness to life subconsciously, your motivation, an attempt at fulfillment. There is no better way of doing that than enacting what you see fit. Even if you're wrong, if you're proven wrong, then you and change your opinion, then that new opinion morally becomes beneficial fulfillment. There is no better life than that. Why would you reside to being content with the depravity when you could die going against it? And I don't mean, as I'm not for violent enactments, because that is oppressive. That is a disruptive tactic. That merely condones the morality that is destroying your willingness to life. But the greatest form of peaceful protest is quite literally just saying, fuck you, I'm gonna go do this. And if you don't want to let me do this, then you can restrain me. Do what you want. And I'll get right back up and try and be free of those restraints. I'm not going to be aggressive when doing it, but the second you let your guard down, I'm going to go right back to trying to do it. You can only... And if then you decide to put a bullet in my head, put a bullet in my head. You decide to throw me out of a living space into the cold, freezing streets where I could die of hypothermia? Go ahead, I'll die of hypothermia. I'll die of starvation. You don't want to give me that food for free? Fine, I'll starve. but I will have died abiding by a life that was fulfilling, a life that was provably morally beneficial. Like, there is only so many times your oppressor can really try to oppress you before they decide to put a bullet in the back of your head. So let them. Didn't do them much. You didn't do them much good. What were they oppressing you for then? They wanted something out of you, clearly. You being subservient to them, whatever it may be, class, race, gender, sexuality, disability, ability. Well, joke's on them. They just destroyed their subservience. Good on you. You wrecked your own hammer that was breaking kneecaps. My point is, let them do you in. Be peaceful. And by peaceful, I don't mean don't vocalize your anger. There are morally beneficial ways of vocalizing your anger that aren't belligerently violent and just the same as your oppressor on a surface level of contradictions to life. I think it's provably so. I will, if push comes to shove, I will die living a life of a nomad, an anarcho-maximalist that tries desperately to not abide by the numerous displays of dehumanization of the world, trying ever so desperately. And I will not, and I make mistakes, obviously. I have not as well thought out critical observation at a specific time. I don't analyze something well, as I clearly did with the farm job that I got. But I will die living that life because I feel it is morally beneficial. No one has proven me otherwise yet. And if people weren't willing to help me, well, that shows me their level of compassion. That shows me how deep-rooted the trauma of this world was. That shows me that, but there are people who will help me. Clearly, I wouldn't be alive right now if people didn't help me. I wouldn't be sitting here in this apartment if people didn't help me. Whether they had tried following a similar morality to me, or if they were complete hypocrites to ideologies that said otherwise. Unnecessary hypocrites, manufactured hypocrites, to innate hypocrisy in terms of paradox of existence. And am I scared about leaving this apartment on February 12th, going back to Leviz? And even if I stay at that shelter for an amount of time, well, having to sleep in doorways of various building units for the rest of the winter? Yeah, of course I am. Not consciously as much as I would have been before, but there is an amount there that is fearfulness. Well, it's all fear, all anxiety, all of it is rooted, all apathy is rooted to fear of death. It's the one great fear. It's the only reason you become afraid of anything. It doesn't have to be some life-shattering thing in that very moment. It's because something disrupted your sense of who you are, of your unconscious desires. Something that propelled you and propelled you to life and affirmed what you were doing with your life. But I will. I'm not breaking on that. And if the help that is in the world, morally beneficial help, doesn't come in time for me, well, then sadly that's where my story ended. It didn't come in time. But it came on time in other instances. Like, I look back on the last 8 months or so of my life. I've done so many things, like on a daily, that I can't even recall them all in one instance where I could articulate it. I've done so many things, such a short amount of time. I'm only 20 years old. And I don't want to hear the excuse that, well, you're built differently, Cam. No, I'm not. You've convinced yourself that you are not able to do what I am doing. That you're not able to have the critical understanding. If you believe that I'm an intelligent person, if that's your opinion of me, you think that you're not able to be as intellectually sound as me or someone like me. You've convinced yourself of that because of years of degradation towards your intelligence. But nonetheless, it's something that you have convinced yourself of. It's not truthful. Look, ultimately, yes, I critically reason. Critically reasoning does not mean certainty. Now, I uploaded a video, a very short video recently. I guess I'll elaborate on here. That as far as I'm concerned, on an in-depth contradicting level, maybe not even really in-depth, just on a surface level you could look at it, I don't know at the moment, that the only two things that you can be certain of in life, or the only thing that you can be certain of, is doing one of two things every day, is that you're either going to go to bed one night and then wake up the next day alive, or you're going to die at some point in the day. Your consciousness will cease forever. Your reticular activating system in your brainstem will be permanently damaged beyond repair, at least as far as the modern invasive advancements, unnecessary advancements to technology go right now, with the possibility in that. But those are the only two things for certain that will happen to you today. You'll go to sleep or you'll die. Whatever you fill the space in between there with is ultimately what happens. On some level, and I really do believe this, you are cowardly if you don't really come to realize that you fear death. You are to some degree cowardly. If you're convinced of that, it's a pretentious idea. Well, no. Thinking that you don't fear death, but nobody wants to die. We all want to be alive for just some, I don't know, unknown random reason, emotionally. Well, that's pretentious. Just thinking that you don't fear death, end sentence, is beyond self-righteous. You would not enact things to sustain your life force, or you perceive as being able to sustain your life force, if you did not have a unwantingness to die. Fine, you don't want to call it what I call biologic thanatophobia. You don't want to call it a fear of death. Fine, it doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned. The subconscious psychobiological mechanism is still the same. Call it whatever you want. It's still a want to not die. And I will not succumb anymore. Try to not succumb any more than I already do. It's my own fears. Because of that fear, that want to life, to the mediocrity and depravity of the systemic and systematic forces of the world. I won't give in. And if my life is cut short from that, Then I made it to 20. Like, if I looking back on my life was not a happy life. My life was not, to use the word, my life was not, in an oversimplified sense, my life was not a good life overall. I have not had a good life, at least what I would consider to the most it could have been, the possible outcomes, a good life. But if I was to die tomorrow, I can safely say, I think by this point, that there were enough satisfactory moments, enough beneficial moments, pleasureful moments, where I can say my life was absolutely, most certainly not wasted. Was not wasted. At least as far as I'm concerned right now. And in that, all things considered, relatively speaking, my life could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse. A lot worse. So the point I'm making is, instead of ending your own life, go with what you feel to be morally right and let the world around you end it for you. And just to close off the video with, I'm not blaming, I don't want this to come across as if I'm blaming those in suicidality, those with depression, with any amount of emotional disorders, as if it's their fault for developing it. No, it's not. For all the individuals surrounding them, socially, and societal systems that are perpetuated by idiotic individuals. It is your fault that these individuals have developed these disorders. And you only do that because of your own disorders that are psychologically formed. So on and so forth, as the intersectionality of all of humanity. So on and so on. It is your fault. Any parents of a child who is severely depressed because, they've said, and it's very obvious, because of immediate functioning of a family unit, it is your fault. It is your fault that your child wants to kill themselves. It is your fault. It is the elitists' fault that the world is financially strapped and people cannot afford, abiding by a capitalist system, to pay off rent for even so much as a studio apartment in a major city. Our groceries have risen so high in price. It is your fault. Your personal responsibility. It's their personal responsibility for abiding by that systematic force of capitalism. The workers underneath you, It is your fault for coercing them into it and making them fearful for their lives if they don't abide by it. It is your fault. It's all of our faults. Let's put it that way. And the same goes for all other forms of oppression. But I'm not going to get into that here. It's all of our faults. In that, I'll talk about this in a different video soon. You can't just, I know you cannot just switch. You can't switch psychological illness on and off like a light switch. People are convinced as if emotions are just a complete, once you tell someone a logically reasonable argument, that they will immediately go through this cognitive shift back to a healthier emotional state in terms of cognition. No, it takes time for this to set in for people to realize. It's not like that. It's not, depression is not something you can turn on and off. But the only thing, as far as I'm concerned, that can resolve depression is critical thought. That is the only thing that can resolve it. It's critical observation, listening to others. That's the only thing that saved me. Nothing else helped. No amount of either of slightly beneficially on a minimalist amount produced medications worked or will work. No amount of terribly produced medications that are promoted as being highly beneficial when have been shown to increase suicidality, Prozac, will help. No amount of just going to a psychologist or a therapist just for them to tell you, have you tried breathing exercises? Have you tried speaking to these people who are causing you issues? Have you tried looking for another job? Have you tried have you tried this? Have you tried that? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? No amount of that will help. The only thing that will help is you critically thinking. And people around you, including the doctors, competent doctors, who actually know about how human science works, who encourage critical thought by sharing their own perspectives and observations. That's the only thing that'll help. I will die, abiding by the morality I see fit. I will not let this world corrupt me more than it already has. I will not just go away from things that are not inherently deplorable, not inherently corrupt, because they've been co-opted and embedded with these terrible ideals. They're not innately terrible. I'll keep defending those. I will die like that. And I am very confident right now. Always the possibility, obviously, that something could go wrong. That I don't find that hope in time, but as I said to my employer who told me that, well, of not being able to really, decisions that have culminated in me not deciding to stay here, going back to the Viz Quebec. Well, I just told them, oh, I'm sure I'll live. I'm sure I'll survive. Survived this long. I'm sure I will be alive when I leave this place. I'm sure I'll be alive one way or another. So, I hope this helps. To anyone who is experiencing severe suicidal ideation, please don't end your life. It is the stupidest thing that you could do, as it is against your nature. Let the world murder you for who you choose to be.